Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to my presentation on challenging the diaspora. So the whole purpose of this entire presentation is to get you guys to rethink the idea of what diaspora is. So we're going to take a look at one specific group. We're going to look at the South Asian diaspora, and we're going to look specifically at a case study of Ugandan Asian refugees. So the majority of current literature on the South Asian diaspora focuses on connections to the Indian subcontinent as the primary homeland. This presentation aims to explore how the identities of some Ugandan Asians are constructed based on their associations of home. Due to their experiences of multiple migrations, the manner in which Ugandan Asians identify themselves are blurred across both space and time. Their sense of belonging and conceptions of home do not fit within the dichotomous associations of the South Asian diaspora. This presentation argues that the displacement of Ugandan Asians within their specific historical and geographical contexts problematizes their association within the South Asian community. As historian Margaret Friends notes, space and time are explicitly linked as they highlight the transnational and global phenomena that can be understood as temporal layers of migration movements. By reviewing the history of South Asians in Uganda, the rupturing of identities based on historical experiences, the concept of home, and the formation of identity via oral interviews and some novels produced by East African Asians, we will understand how Ugandan Asians have multiple, complex, and contested constructions of identities and attachments to place. So reviewing the history of South Asians in Uganda serves as an important mechanism to comprehend how the experiences of Ugandan Asians are unique in comparison to other East African Asians. So the majority of migration began in the 1850s. There were two main groups of migrants that came. The first were indentured laborers, and they consisted of the minority, and then the majority were merchants and traders. Their migration into East Africa coincided with British imperialism and expansion throughout the region. This is partly due to India being under colonial rule at the time, and thus they were extended protection under the British Crown. Once in Uganda, the colonialists established a three-tiered race and class hierarchy. At the top, you had white British colonials, on the middle, you had brown South Asians, and on the bottom were local black Ugandans. Using their kind of privileged position within this situation, South Asians actually ended up dominating the economy over time. These kinds of racial divisions and segregation was manifested within things like the secretariat, where you had a separate bathroom for whites, a separate bathroom for browns, a separate bathroom for blacks. It was within residential neighborhoods, it was within the hospitals and schooling districts. They even had sports teams that would compete amongst each other based on racial divisions, as well as even religious divisions as well. What ends up happening is by the 1970s, it is estimated that South Asians controlled about 80 to 90% of Ugandan trade and about 80% of the commercial sector. Their economic success, as well as advice from friends and family, increased the number of Asians living in Uganda from about 5,000 in 1921 to approximately 80,000 by 1970. With these heightened levels of migration in conjunction with their privileged position in society, Ugandan Asians became the targets of Ugandan nationalists as colonial collaborators after Ugandan independence in 1962. Although Asians only represented about 1% of the population, they were charged with economic sabotage and a failure to integrate with local Ugandans. Under the premises of social exclusion and economic dominance, the president at the time, Idi Amin, in August of 1972, expelled every single Ugandan Asian from the country. They were ordered to leave within 90 days and were forced to leave everything behind. Ugandan Asians were thus labeled as refugees and forcibly relocated internationally. As a whole, about 30,000 ended up going to the United Kingdom, 10,000 went to India, 8,000 actually came here to Canada, and that's actually my dissertation project. 9,000 went to Europe, and smaller numbers ended up going to the United States, Pakistan, and Malawi, Australia, New Zealand as well. By the end of the decree, there were only about 2,000 Ugandan Asians that remained in the country. It's also imperative to note that Asians who migrated to Uganda were a diverse and heterogeneous group. They had created several institutions based on religious and regional affiliations and included Christians, Jains, Goans, Hindus belonging to various denominations, multiple Sikh communities, several other Shia and Sunni Muslims. Reviewing their history of migration and expulsion provides the necessary historical background to understanding the various ruptures in their identity. Viewed within this historical context, there are several points where attachments to South Asia, Britain, and Uganda are theoretically severed. As more South Asians continue to migrate and be born within Uganda, their attachment to the Indian subcontinent was replaced with a sense of being Ugandan. Furthermore, after the partition of India in 1947, there was no campaign or effort made to create a pan-South Asian identity. There were far greater problems within the subcontinent dealing with the new creation of India, as well as East and West Pakistan. With regards to a sense of British belonging, this was fundamentally altered with the 1968 British Immigration Act. So what this act did was it barred any newly independent Commonwealth passport holder, so in this case, anyone from East Africa, the entire region of East Africa, who did not have a single parent or grandparent who was a British citizen or a naturalized British citizen. This effectively demonstrated how East African Asians were no longer welcome in the United Kingdom. In relation to Uganda, their status as foreigners was made starkly evident by the expulsion decree itself. These historical events play a crucial role in understanding the conceptions of home after relocation for Ugandan Asians. The resettlement of Ugandan Asians to various geographical locales has forced them to reconstruct their sense of home. As Alison Blunt and Robin Dowling argue, and I quote, "These international movements are also processes of establishing home, as centers of belonging and identity move over space and are created in new places," end quote. Within the Ugandan Asian example, as noted earlier, these recreations of home are also situated within a specific time in addition to place. For Ugandan Asians, their history of migration and expulsion informs their creations of home through a variety of ways, including the relationship between home and homeland, the existence of multiple homes, diverse homemaking practices, and the intersection of home, memory, identity, and belonging. Using this conception of home, the construction of identity for Ugandan Asians becomes particularly complex. On the one hand, Asian populations who lived in colonial territories possess a dual identity. They possess both a link to South Asia and to Britain, but this is problematized by their non-white skin color. On the other hand, the ideas of a homeland may not necessarily be associated to the Indian subcontinent, as many felt an attachment to Uganda. This is demonstrated when reviewing the objects within homes of British Ugandan Asians. In her analysis of visual and material cultures, Devia Toyle-Kelly describes the importance of tacky remnants of a commodified ecosystem, such as elephant tusks, zebra skins, ivory necklaces, and leopard skin bags, for female British Ugandan Asians. She argues that these objects held little value while migrants lived in East Africa. However, they gained heightened levels of importance within the United Kingdom as signifiers of identity. Their value increases due to the dislocation of Ugandan Asians and their possessions, thus creating a social context of recognition and signification. This problematizes the conception of membership within the South Asian diaspora for Ugandan Asians. As Toyle-Kelly argues, quote, "These figures act as mediators between times of lived experience and a sense of East African heritage that contributes to British Asianness," end quote. These objects are prized possessions within the homes of Ugandan Asians, and which denotes their attachment and sense of belonging to Uganda. These objects signify the multiple senses of belonging for British Ugandan Asians whose specific history has shaped their construction of identity and their recreation of home in Britain. Oral interviews conducted by Johanna Herbert provide examples of how Ugandan Asians identify themselves several years after relocation. Herbert argues that the majority of scholars have downplayed their attachments to East Africa because they physically resemble South Asians. As Herbert states, quote, "The expulsion served to consolidate their distinctive identity, which retelling this aspect of their life reinforces," end quote. Those who were interviewed distinctively noted their attachment to Uganda as a homeland instead of the Indian subcontinent. As one interviewee notes, quote, "I think it, Uganda, was home because there wasn't any other home besides that," end quote. The interviewee highlights how personally there wasn't any other home, and thus exemplifies a detachment from South Asia as a home or homeland. Another respondent identifies their attachment to Uganda before the expulsion decree. Quote, "We never felt until 1972 when we were told, 'You are foreigners.' Until then, we never felt that this was not our home, end quote. The expulsion decree served as a stark reminder for Ugandan Asians that the local population did not consider them to be Ugandans. Furthermore, another sense of attachment to Uganda was demonstrated in recollections of Ugandan Asians to the physical environment of Uganda. Ugandan Asians felt most at home when they reflected on their experiences and interactions with Uganda's landscape. For example, the memories of picnics were common amongst interviewees, highlighting their close association with Uganda's environment. In summary, Herbert concludes that some Ugandan Asians used their multiple affiliations to create a rich sense of identity, while for others it created a dilemma as to where they felt they belonged. These conceptions are further complicated with the incorporation of a gendered analysis. For the majority of interviewees in a separate study, male and female British Ugandan Asians had alternative constructions of identity. For males, the sense of loss was multifaceted and deeply felt, whereas for females, their personal stories reveal a variety of experiences. Respondents had varying interpretations based on gender, based on the expulsion decree itself. Males described instances of having to protect female Ugandan Asians from the violence of Ugandan officials. One interviewee notes, quote, "They even had the guts to ask my wife to remove her golden ring out of her finger, and also tried to force, I would use the word snatching, the bracelet out of her neck," end quote. Some women did echo the same sentiments of fear. However, others viewed the relocation as an adventure. Some Ugandan Asians described alternative stories of interactions with Ugandan officials. One female Ugandan Asian interviewee described that, quote, "The army was not cruel like you've heard in some countries where there is a coup. The people are raped and looted and this and that. It didn't happen where we were, and we are very, very lucky in that respect," end quote. Memories of the expulsion period form an essential part of identity for many Ugandan Asians today. However, their distinct historical experience informs while simultaneously complicating their construction of identity. These multiple allegiances and complex associations to Homeland are also demonstrated in popular literature written by Ugandan Asians and other East African Asians. Reviewing novels published by Ugandan Asians and other East African authors demonstrates how they portray and reflect the multiple and contested identities of Ugandan Asians. As Malapandarang argues, literary narratives are a tangible source of understanding how identity is constructed and negotiated within the migration process. Three of the novels we're going to look at are written by Bahadur Tijani, Peter Nazareth, and M.G. Visunji. In the first novel, Tijani's Day After Tomorrow, he questions a sense of belonging for South Asian migrants in East Africa by denouncing their in-group exclusivity. This highlights the feelings of exclusion from Ugandan society beyond Idi Amin's expulsion decree. The emotional pain for many Ugandan Asians expellees is articulated in Peter Nazareth's novel. As the protagonist bids farewell to Uganda while on a plane to London, he exclaims, quote, "Goodbye, Mother Africa, your bastard son loved you," end quote. Both Tijani and Nazareth demonstrate how identity is contested for Ugandan Asians. On the one hand, feelings of exclusion from Ugandan society are emphasized by their in-group solidarity that Tijani believes demonstrates the purposeful failure of Ugandan Asians to integrate socially with Ugandans. Conversely, Nazareth's protagonist truly felt a sense of belonging to Africa and felt betrayed upon expulsion. Furthermore, once Nazareth's main character arrives in London, he feels lonely in a way he never did in Africa, like a piece of driftwood. This echoes the emotions of some of the interviewees in Herbert's study who felt as if they belonged nowhere. In the final novel, No New Land by M.S. Visunji, reveals how Ugandan Asians have constructed their identities in Canada. These characters struggle to fit within the Canadian milieu and opt to create their own East African community and reject a pan-South Asian identity. In an analysis of Visunji's work, it demonstrates the hybrid, fluid, and multiple identities of Ugandan Asians, which enable them to belong both to East Africa and other spaces, such as Britain, North America, and South Asia. As Ugandan Asian authors, their works have evidently been constructed around their own beliefs and opinions of belonging. These texts exemplify how Ugandan Asians construct identity in multiple ways and ultimately complicates conceptions of home, homeland, and the South Asian diaspora. Upon reviewing the history of Ugandan Asians, we have explored how both history and geography have shaped their conceptions of identity and belonging. Their experiences are unique from other East African Asians, and their migrations alter associations of home compared to other South Asians. This problematizes the concept of a South Asian and homogeneous South Asian diaspora. Even though they may physically appear to be South Asian, many Ugandan Asians view Uganda as their home. Alternatively, other Ugandan Asians, as argued by Herbert, felt as if they belonged nowhere. However, Herbert, as well as the Ugandan Asian novelists, highlight the various attachments of Ugandan Asians who possess multiple and fluid identities. Ultimately, further research on Ugandan Asians in Canada and in other countries will provide a better understanding of identity construction and senses of belonging for Ugandan Asians. Thank you.